The American Revolution didn't begin with a single shot. It began with decisions, political decisions, economic decisions, arrogant decisions. By the time muskets fired at Lexington and Concord, the outcome wasn't shocking. It was predictable. These are the 5 decisions that made the American Revolution inevitable. Number 5. Taxing the colonies without representation. When the 7 Years' War ended in 1763, Britain had won a massive empire, but at enormous cost. The war had nearly doubled Britain's national debt. British leaders believed the American colonies, which had benefited from the removal of French threats in North America, should help pay for their own defense. From London's perspective, this was logical. From the colonies' perspective, it was dangerous. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act. Unlike previous trade regulations, the Stamp Act was a direct internal tax. It required official stamped paper for newspapers, contracts, wills, legal documents, and even playing cards. For the first time, colonists were being taxed directly by Parliament, a body in which they had no elected representatives. Colonial leaders did not argue that Parliament had no authority at all. They argued something more specific. Only their own elected colonial assemblies had the right to tax them. If Parliament could tax them without consent, then colonial self-government was meaningless. Protests erupted across cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Effigies of British officials were burned. Stamp distributors resigned under pressure. Crowds intimidated tax collectors. Merchants organized boycotts of British goods. The economic pressure worked. The Stamp Act was repealed in 1766. But Parliament simultaneously passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. In other words, Britain backed down, but only temporarily. The conflict had shifted from money to power. Trust was fractured. Suspicion hardened. The colonies had tested resistance, and it worked. That realization changed everything. Number 4. The Townshend Act and military presence. Parliament learned from the Stamp Act backlash, but it did not abandon taxation. Instead, it shifted tactics. In 1767, Parliament passed the Townshend Acts. These imposed duties on imported goods like glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. Unlike the Stamp Act, these were external taxes on imports. But the revenue was used for something more controversial: to pay the salaries of royal governors and judges in the colonies. That meant colonial officials were no longer financially dependent on local legislatures. Britain wasn't just raising revenue. It was restructuring authority. Colonists responded again with organized resistance. Women led spinning bees to produce homemade cloth. Merchants boycotted British imports. Political writers attacked parliamentary overreach. Tensions escalated further when British troops were sent to Boston in 1768 to enforce order. Armed soldiers living among civilians created constant friction. Street fights broke out. Insults were exchanged daily. Propaganda circulated widely. And then on March 5th, 1770, the tension snapped. After a confrontation between colonists and British soldiers, shots were fired. 5 colonists were killed. The event became known as the Boston Massacre. Paul Revere's engraving portrayed British soldiers as ruthless aggressors. Though Parliament later repealed most of the Townshend duties, the tax on tea remained. The principle of taxation and control remained unsolved. The military presence convinced many colonists that Britain saw them not as partners, but as subjects to be controlled. Number 3. The Tea Act and the Intolerable Acts. By 1773, Britain faced a new problem. The British East India Company was struggling financially. Parliament passed the Tea Act to allow the company to sell tea directly to the colonies at a lower price, bypassing colonial merchants. Ironically, tea became cheaper, but the tax remained, and the monopoly was obvious. Colonists feared this was a trap, a way to make them accept Parliament's right to tax in principle. On December 16, 1773, members of the Sons of Liberty boarded ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. The act was bold. It was illegal. It was deliberate. Britain responded with the coercive acts in 1774. Boston Harbor was closed until the tea was paid for. Massachusetts' charter was altered. Town meetings were restricted. British officials accused of crimes could be tried in Britain. In America, these became known as the Intolerable Acts. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, they united the colonies. Other colonies sent food and supplies to Boston. Public opinion shifted. The question was no longer about taxation. It was about self-rule. Number 2. The First Continental Congress. In 1774, representatives from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia. Georgia was not represented. This gathering became known as the First Continental Congress. For the first time, colonial leaders coordinated a unified political response. Delegates included figures like George Washington and John Adams. They debated how far to go. Some wanted reconciliation. Others believed conflict was unavoidable. The Congress ultimately agreed to boycott British goods, support Massachusetts, demand repeal of the Intolerable Acts, assert colonial rights. They also agreed to reconvene if grievances were not addressed. This was critical. The colonies were no longer isolated entities. They were operating collectively. Britain now faced coordinated resistance, not scattered protests. This was the moment that colonial identity began transforming into American identity. Number 1. The March to Lexington and Concord. By early 1775, both sides were preparing. Colonial militias stockpiled weapons in towns like Concord. British General Thomas Gage received orders to seize those supplies. On April 18, 1775, British troops marched from Boston towards Concord. Riders like Paul Revere spread warning through the countryside. At Lexington Green, colonial militia stood waiting. A confrontation occurred. A shot was fired. To this day, no one knows who fired first. But once shots were exchanged, the political crisis became open war. British forces moved on to Concord, where fighting intensified at the North Bridge. As British troops retreated towards Boston, colonial militia harassed them along the road. Hundreds were killed or wounded. Within days, thousands of colonial militiamen surrounded Boston. The siege of Boston had begun. At that point, compromise was nearly impossible. Blood had been shed. The revolution was underway. The American Revolution was not an accident. It was not a sudden uprising. It was the result of escalating decisions. Taxation without representation, political control, punitive laws, colonial unity, and military force. Each step made compromise harder. Each response made resistance stronger. By the time muskets fired in April 1775, independence was no longer unthinkable. It was inevitable. History rarely turns on a single moment. It turns on a series of decisions. And these 5 decisions made revolution unavoidable. Thank you for watching this video on the 5 decisions that led to the American Revolution. Hit the like and subscribe buttons, share with your friends, and if you would like to see a topic explored in a future video, then mention it down in the comments. Make sure to hit the bell icon to be notified when new videos are released. Have a great day, and see you in the next episode of History in 10 Minutes or Less.